So key takeaways. What I want to do is really get over why conditional access is absolutely core to Zero Trust, right? And Zero Trust, what is Zero Trust? Well, basically, if you think about it in on-prem AD days, what happened is you went and authenticated, and then you were given a TGT, ticket granting ticket, which was valid for 10 hours, right? And you were never re-authenticated for that 10 hours, right? You had that, and you could go and get session tickets to go to different servers. And what we need to be able to do is continuously evaluate access. And that is what conditional access does for us. I want to look at how conditional access is actually triggered. So when does it get triggered? And that's very important as well. And also, we'll look at some of the more esoteric aspects of conditional access. I always do this demo live. The reason being, it's quite interesting. Sometimes you can go in there and goodness me, it's all changed from yesterday. Microsoft are doing a huge amount of work on this. I'm involved in a couple of private previews, and if you're not familiar with Microsoft sort of private public previews, what happens is it's a very small group of people that look at something in private preview, and once it's been approved at private preview, it goes into public preview, which is sort of generally available to everyone, right? But during the public preview, they're still getting feedback in and sort of tuning the product. And there's some very, very interesting stuff around conditional access that is coming up, which unfortunately I can't talk about. I'd love to, because I'm really excited about it. Okay, conditional access. What's it about? It's about authenticating to applications, right? And those applications could be, SaaS apps, could be Office 365, it could be Salesforce, or any of Workday, any of the SaaS apps that are available. What's important about it is using a federated protocol of some kind to sign in, right? We could have our own web apps, again, using a federated protocol of some kind, or we could have, I don't like describing them as legacy, but I'll use the term a legacy app, which is maybe using Windows authentication or host header authentication, which is possibly sitting on-prem. And what we need is an interface between the federated protocols and the on-prem protocols. And if you look at the Azure AD suite for that, you've got the Azure AD application proxy, right? But, all the big vendors, F5, etc., all provide this sort of secure hybrid access model where we authenticate to the edge, right, to the appliance using federated protocol, and then we do a protocol transition to on-prem. And that's what we need. That's our aim. It is controlling access to those guys. So what do we need? First of all, we need an authentication engine which manages all the federated protocols. And we need to arrange that every single application is authenticated by that authentication engine, Azure AD in this case. Okay, so we get authenticated, and having been authenticated, the next thing we can do is actually start evaluating. And we evaluate on a whole number of factors. And this is something that's getting more and more comprehensive. So what are we? Are we a user? Are we a workload identity, which basically means we're authenticating using the identity of an application? Right, so it's like a batch process, if you like, but we're using application identity rather than user identity. The next thing is, where are we located? What are we trying to gain access to? Right? What is the sign-in risk that we're prepared to accept? Right? And are we, again, user and workload risk as well can be evaluated. So that is what we're using, our users. The next thing is, we've got threat intelligence that's running. So if we're going to say, if we're going to let people in, if their sign-in risk is below, a low factor or a medium factor, who's categorizing that? That is the Microsoft intelligence that's doing that. So we need to be able to do that and bring that into our policy engine. And then, of course, all these guys are sitting on some sort of platform. Right? So we need to bring in all of that information. Is it managed? Is it bring your own device? Is it healthy and compliant, right? Is there a device risk associated with it? Type of operating system, and so on. We need to bring those in. And then, there are things that we could do, but in terms of health and compliance, how do we evaluate that? Well, we can evaluate it by bringing in things like Intune, and the Microsoft Defender products will all enhance the signals that are available to us. So we are getting as many signals from here as possible and feeding them into the conditional access policy engine. So what does the policy engine then do? It could block access, right? So you don't want to block access if there's a way of remediating it. So if you can, you do some form of remediation, and it might be that you've got a high or medium risk on a user, and you say, okay, well, that's possibly their credentials have been leaked, so let's force a password reset on them, right? So that's possible to do. Obviously, we could increase assurance by having MFA, and now fairly recently in the product became categorizing the authentication strength of MFA. And the highest categorization of that is to actually use phishing resistant. And by phishing resistant, if you imagine you've got a user who's about to sign into Azure and they get lured to a man in the middle, right? And that man in the middle basically makes a connection for the user. The user thinks they're connected to Azure, and then the man in the middle is actually making the connection to Azure itself. And to completely guard against that, you need to use MFA, but you need to use phishing resistant MFA, right? Which basically means the man in the middle breaks the MFA. And you've got Windows Hello, you've got certificate-based authentication, and you've also got FIDO2 security keys, right? So that's really important, is bringing in that additional strength. So we've decided to allow this user, this workload on this device at this location to access the application. The next thing we can do is actually put in place session controls so we can monitor the session that's happening. And when we monitor the session that's happening, we could actually block certain file downloads. We could block files that have sensitive information because we can scan those files and categorize them as such. Right? And we can also say how often someone needs to sign in and so on. So that's it. That's conditional access in action. There's a lot to it. And all of this, what you can do here, what you can do here, what you can do with these additional signals is getting more and more and more sophisticated. Right? But what we need to do is, first of all, ask ourselves the question is, when is conditional access evaluated? So it's evaluated anytime you get a SAML token. A SAML token is a federated token, and it could be that you're using SAML protocol. You could use WS Federation, but it's a SAML token, right? So we've gone up to Azure and said, please, can I have a token to prove my identity to this application? When one of those is used, whenever an ID token is used, and whenever an access token is used. Again, what exactly is an ID token and access token, I will come to in 1 second. And it's also evaluated when you use cookies or session tokens. So if I sign into Azure, what I end up with is a cookie that proves my authentication to Azure. So imagine I go to an app, it sends me up to Azure, I sign into Azure, I've now got a cookie, right? I go to another app, it sends me up to Azure, I pass the cookie. Right? At that point, conditional access is reevaluated. Right? And then there's this concept of a refresh token. Again, exactly what it is, I'll come to in 1 second. But every time a refresh token is used, continuous access is reevaluated. So if we look at the authentication story, and I'm going to go into a little bit of detail of this because if you actually understand this, I think it's very useful in terms of sort of setting the scene in your head how authentication actually works. What we do is we end up going to an application, and the application will say, haha, you're not authenticated. Well, if you were already authenticated to the app, you would probably have a cookie to prove it. That's not a cookie for Azure. It's a cookie to prove you're authenticated to the app, in which case you've got access. Right? If you're not authenticated to the app says, you need to go and get authenticated. You need to go to the security token service that I trust. And the I trust bit is, in this case, it trusts Azure AD to issue a token that will be accepted to the app. So we end up with this rather complex redirect string, which basically says in its simplest form, please authenticate this user to this application. But it can be way more complex than that. And I'll show you one shortly. So the authentication flow is you go to the application, so we browse to the app says you're not authenticated and redirects us off to Azure AD. We've arrived at Azure AD and Azure AD says you need to authenticate. And there's lots and lots of different ways that you can authenticate. But what we do is we authenticate with Azure AD, and Azure AD gives back a security token. Right? I deliberately haven't said what sort of security token, because whether you're using SAML protocol, WS Federation, OpenID Connect, it's all very similar in terms of this flow. So we get back a security token. The security token is going to prove that the user is authenticated to the app. At that point in time, we also get back a cookie. That cookie proves the user is authenticated to Azure AD. Right? We then go back to the app. The app will then validate that token, and then the app itself will give us back a cookie to prove we're authenticated to the app. So now if I go back to the app again, I'm going to use this gray cookie down the bottom. Let's see this one here. If I go back to Azure, I will use the orange cookie to prove that I'm already authenticated to Azure. Okay, any questions on that? No, there is. So okay, this and no. In terms of OpenID Connect and OAuth 2, there's this thing called an introspection service. So what the app can do is it can say, oh, I want to just check before I'm going to allow you to do this. I want to check that the token is still valid, and it's just in time. You go up to the security token service and say, hey, is this token valid?
And can it still do the it still
but there's a but on that.
Yeah,
Microsoft do not implement an introspection service. Okay. All right. And what you'll see is there is sort of replacement of that is the continuous access evaluation. But I will come to that.
Thank you, John. Yeah.
All right.
That's good. Thank you.
Okay. Does that answer the question? Okay. Any other questions before we? By the way, feel free, just shout out if you've got a question. I'm more than happy to. Okay, so there we are. We're signed in. OpenID Connect and OAuth 2. A user authenticates to the app, the front-end app, if you like, the website, using an ID token. And that proves, the ID token proves the user is authenticated for access to the app. The app itself can have an access token, right? And the app uses this access token to call a backend API, right? And it can do it. The user could have disappeared. The user could have gone offline, and the app still has an access token and can call the backend API. Right? So that's the access token issuance of that. That is OAuth 2. The layered on top of OAuth 2 is OpenID Connect, which gives us an ID token. Right? So ID tokens proves the user's authentication to the app. The access token proves that the application is authorized to access the backend app. And that actual token could be with the identity of the app, in which case it's a workload identity, or it could be a delegated in the identity of the user, right? In which case it would be a user identity. So that's the that's a sort of OpenID Connect and OAuth 2. Now, there's this concept of refresh token, because if you think about this here, this app needs to access the backend system, right? Regardless of whether the user's logged in or not. I mean, that's one of the ways of operating. Right? So it's going to need this access token. So what's going to be the lifetime of that access token? Well, if this app needs to carry on doing things when the user's disappeared, you could say, oh, you have to make it really long. The problem is, if you make it really long, you are never going back to Azure AD and saying, hey, can I have a new one? All right, so there's never a chance of Azure AD saying, no, you're no longer valid to have one. All right, so to solve that problem, the access token lifetime is kept relatively short. It's about an hour. Right? I say about an hour because Microsoft introduced jitter. So it sort of could be 45 minutes, it could be 90 minutes, right? It sort of shifts around those sort of times. And the idea of jitter was that, everyone logs on in the morning at 9 o'clock and they don't get swamped at 10 o'clock, right? So that's the idea behind jitter. So to get around this problem of, dealing with this, they also brought in the idea of the refresh token. Now, if you've heard of continuous access evaluation, just forget that for the moment, all right? So the idea of the refresh token is every hour, you have to go back to Azure and say, hey, can I have a new token, please? All right, but the user's disappeared, so you can't prompt the user to log in again. And if you prompt the user to log in, if the user existed, they could use their cookie to re-authenticate. So the user's gone, potentially. And what's happening now is that you send your refresh token up to Azure, and the refresh token has a long lifetime. Azure can now check that you're still allowed to have an access token, and it's making that decision every hour. And that's where the refresh token existed. Okay, but of course, people didn't like waiting for an hour. People also sort of said, hey, what about introspection endpoints where the app at any time can go and say, hey, is this token still valid? Well, Microsoft never implemented that. And it's not something they did wrong. If you look at the protocols, their protocols are framework standards. So you can sort of pick and choose which bits you implement. And it's always something to bear in mind if you're taking an app from one identity provider, moving it, it's an OAuth 2 app. Will it work? It depends what was available in the other provider and what they're using. So you need to be slightly careful of that. So continuous access evaluation, it's a work in progress, and it's actually the whole thing is continuous access evaluation protocol. And CAEP is a work in progress. It's the Shared Signals Framework working group. You can have a look at the guide if you want to. CAEP is quite a way off, right? But Microsoft said, well, hang on a minute. Why don't we implement CAE, which is the core of CAEP? And you'll see how they can do that. So with CAE, the IDP and the API that you're going to sort of talk to each other. And the API actually subscribes to the IDP, right? And if this was a third-party API, then there would need to be a protocol for that subscription, which is part of the CAEP protocol. But seeing as that is Azure AD, and that is a Microsoft API, Microsoft can implement the CAE behavior. And they're working with the group, so they're feeding back, what they found, how they're doing things. So what happens now is we've subscribed, and we're going to be informed about significant events, right? So our application does a request using the access token. And what the API does, it says, okay, let's do a policy check. Is this, it's just coming from a different network address. It's a policy violation, all right? Or it's also checking for these significant events. Significant events, users change their password, right? Users' accounts being locked and various other events. And if you're notified of those, what will happen is the API will actually deny access, and it returns what's called a claims challenge. Now, the application needs to be CAE aware. So if you're used to the Microsoft authentication libraries, MSAL, right, they are CAE aware. The earlier one, the ADL, is not CAE aware. Right. So if you're not CAE aware, what would happen is your access token was rejected, and you go, oh, something must have gone wrong. Let's get the access token out of cache and send it off again. Then it's rejected, and you just sit there in a loop. Right? So what you've got to know is how to respond to a claims challenge. Right? So we respond to a claims challenge by actually going to Azure and saying, here's my claims challenge. Can I have a new access token, please? And at that point, Azure can do what it likes. It can say, no, your account's locked. Or it can say, yes, you can, but now you have to do multi-factor. Right? So we can change all of that. Okay, so that is CAE, and it works absolutely beautifully. So I've put in there, authenticate the user, ... in whatever way. It could be block the user, but you then go back with a new access token. So Microsoft CAE very much focused on Exchange, Teams, SharePoint, APIs that they know they control. And critical events is user account, deleted, disabled, etc. Keep an eye on the documentation because it is changing. All right, and in terms of the policy, it's network location at the moment. Okay.
That would replace my need for
talking to the introspection endpoint. Absolutely, yes.
The applications in control can force the event. That's really
Yeah, and the other thing is the introspection endpoint is quite heavyweight.
Yes.
Because you need to authenticate to it, and the question is, how on earth do you authenticate to an introspection endpoint? Do you use some form of, some organizations use sort of a basic authentication of some kind, and it causes a lot of problems.
Yes.
So this is a really nice replacement.
Thank you very much.
Now, if you look at an Outlook client access token, this is a token which was issued with CAE disabled. I did actually, 2020, I actually snagged this a long time ago, and it's issued at, and its expiry, and it's approximately an hour. Right, so it's 16:16, 17:21, hour and 5 minutes actually. This doesn't have jitter. I actually captured this pre-jitter days. Right, and then this is CAE enabled. And it goes from 1905 to 2018. You go, well, that's not much longer. But look, it's the 28th to the 29th. All right, so with CAE, the access token can remain up to 28 hours being valid. Okay, so that's the revocation of the access token actually now becomes event and policy driven. Right, which is really important and no longer relies on an attempt to renew a token, because that's the only time, but using a refresh token, you would have been reevaluated. So if I do a little demo of that, just for go into a bit of detail on that, let me go over to my Windows 10 box. And I'm on my Windows 10, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start off, I've got Fiddler running, and I'll talk about that in a second. I'm going to go off, and I'm going to go to my application. Let me just make sure I'm going to go to the correct application. Yeah, I'm going to go to OIDC v2. These applications, by the way, are framework test harnesses that I use. I can authenticate in any way I like with these apps. So we come over to the application. I'm going to actually go and we'll sign in with OpenID Connect to the tenant, and it shot me up to Azure AD, right? And in that URL up here is everything I need to know, or everything Azure AD needs to know in terms of authenticating this user. So we've got the endpoint we're going to, which is the authorize endpoint. We've got the client ID, which is the identity of the application. We then got, where to redirect this thing after the after the authentication's been done, we need to know, we've gone up to Azure, where's Azure going to send us? We need to know where to send it back with the token. And then there's, the fact that's got truncated. Let's do that. Delete that. Put that over back here. Control Z, that should bring it back. And then, the response mode and things like that. I'm not going to go into the details of that. This is quite a complex string. I'm very happy to do another session for you sometime where I go through all of this. You'll also find it not today on my YouTube channel, but shortly. And just for fun, I was looking at, I've just been evaluating, ChatGPT and Bing AI chat and things, and thinking, are they useful? All right. Can you use them today? And I decided absolutely as a buddy, all right? A buddy to help me do things and a buddy to help me troubleshoot. And I thought, well, look, hang on a minute. Let's just, let me just go and get that again. Why don't I just drop that into, sorry, I need to do this. Go over here. Why don't I just drop that into ChatGPT and just say decode URL and explain. And drop it in, and there you go. So it's actually telling you everything there is in that URL. Yeah, hell, I've just done myself out of a job. Yeah, so I'm actually releasing a video on looking at 3 different scenarios with AI, and that hopefully will get released tomorrow. But it's also, I've got the AI as, I think, potentially hallucinated at some point, which means it's basically made stuff up. And then it's actually miscalculating a timestamp. And I wanted to sort of, but as a buddy, as a sounding board to discuss stuff with, it is immensely powerful. And that's really, start using it today for that reason. And I think the other thing, people go through, oh, all the children are going to be writing their essays and everything. All the children are adding up using calculators. We sort of tried to ban calculators in schools a bit, but I think we have to embrace this technology and work out how we can embrace it and move forward together with the technology. So anyway, I can go on for ages about AI. Right, back to Windows 10. Let's show you a few scenarios. So I'm going to go and I'm going to sign in, and well, I actually could have completed that sign in, but let's do this. I'm going to sign in, and I'm actually going to ask for a slightly different profile, update that, and I'm going to go in with code flow. Oh, we got a string. It's slightly more complicated because I've asked for these extra things. Signing in. It's password-based sign in. I've had the password autofill, and I'm signed in, and it's given me back an ID token and an access token. And if we look in the access token, there's an AMR claim, which is the authentication method reference claim, and it's saying you did it with a password. All right, let's go to a different application, and this is a V1 application. And I'm going to sign in with OpenID on here, John again, password, and this app requires MFA. So I'm just going to approve the sign in. And if you've not seen the sign in that goes into the Authenticator app now, it's actually now the standard is it displays your organization, it displays the name you're signing in with, the application you're signing in with, and it gives you a little map of the location. It's showing London because the data center's in London, where I'm actually connected to these. So all I need to do is put in 13, and there, oops, sorry, I'm putting 13 into the laptop, not into my phone. And that's approved the sign in, and I've got password and MFA. Okay, I'm using session cookies. So I close the browser, the session cookie is gone. All right, let's go back in again and sign in to IDCV2. And I'm going to come in here again, choosing my options, update that, code flow, and I've gone in as John, no change to what we saw before. But rather than closing my browser, I'm now going to go to OIDC v1. What do you think will happen? It will use the old cookie, but remember OIDC v1 is MFA. So it'll use the old cookie, and what's going to happen? Yeah, well, no, because the MFA token there isn't one, but it's just going to prompt me for MFA. So if I go now to OIDC v1 and go in OpenID, it's literally just prompting me for the MFA. So it's got it. I signed in with a password. All right, it's in a cookie. I've now gone to a different application, gone back to Azure, passed my password cookie up, and now what it's doing is just saying, okay, well, you've got a password cookie. Let's get you a strong auth cookie and approve the sign in. So that's 11 done. And now I'm in with password and MFA. Okay, so that's the cookie. Now, one last thing I want to show you is this refresh token business. So I've got going into OIDC v2. Again, I'm going to, by the way, offline access here gives me a refresh token. And I'm going to sign in here, update that, code flow. And I'm going to go in here as my user, John, and convert the code to token. And if you look down here, these are Unix times. So it's a number of seconds since January 1901. Unix had an epoch in 1901. Somehow I don't think so. It's 1970. So it's a significant Unix event, and they needed a timer. So it's showing 603 here in this token. If I go down and use my refresh token, I can come in here, refresh the access token, and it's now showing 640. So it is a new access token. Okay, let me now go across to here, and I'm going to go into the Entra portal. So I'm in. So if you're not familiar, the Azure AD used to be done through the Azure AD portal, and you went to Azure. But now we're going through Entra. And actually, let me just click home. Entra is Microsoft's gathering together everything to do with Identity Fabric. Right, so Azure, Active Directory, permissions management, identity governance, etc., and verified IDs, which is what I looked at in the last session I did here. So I'm just going into Active Directory. Now, this is interesting. It's sort of hunt the thimble. Where have they moved it to? What do they rename it? Well, it's now under Protect and Secure rather than under Security. Conditional access. And what I want to do is go and change one conditional access policy, which is, no, I didn't write it down. That's annoying. Oh, yes, sorry, I did. Where are we? 14. So I'm just going down to 14. And what this has got is, this is my application. I'll talk about these names later. MFA for John, when, always. In my dev environment, I always use users. The reason being, if I use groups, I've then got to remember who's in which group. And therefore, in terms of testing, it's a lot easier to use users. I'm going to turn that on. And the condition is that it uses MFA. Okay, so now let's go back to the client. And let's use the refresh token again. And I go and use the refresh token, and it fails. right? Now, what you've got to remember is this is my browser. It's the user in the browser session. What's happened is the failures failed between the server and Azure AD, because it's the server using the refresh token that gives it back. So if I go across to my server, I happen to be running Fiddler on there, and I've got an error message. And if you look at that error, well, actually, if you look at the grant type is refresh token. If I look at the header, it's showing it's a 400 bad request. All right? And if I look at the JSON that's returned, and I can come down here, let me just grab that and stick that into Notepad. Due to a configuration change made by your administrator, or because you've moved to a new location, you must use multi-factor authentication. Well, the app can't. Right? So what it has to do, it has to get the user to re-authenticate. So if I go back to my Windows here, go home on that, and I choose to sign in with CodeFlow, it's re-authenticating and now asking me for the second factor. Right. So the idea of this sort of little section was to try and get you to really understand when conditional access is evaluated, which is really, really important. Okay, any questions on that? Nothing at all? Okay, all right. In that case, what time did you want to break, Jack?
You are bang on time for right now. If you wanted to break now for 5 minutes.
Or can we have another 10 minutes and then break? Are you all right for another 10 minutes? Yeah, okay. So this is my sort of, cartoonish drawing of Azure AD. What we have is a user, and we have workload identities, right? And they're coming to Azure AD, and they need to authenticate in some way. And I have what we call the authentication booths. Are they our users? Are they guest users? And then there's lots of different ways that you can authenticate. I've done it on my YouTube channel. I've done an extremely comprehensive demo of the new, all the different ways of actually authenticating and the new authentication policies in Azure. But I could come up here with a session token or a refresh token, right? So, or if I was a user, I could be authenticating with a username and password, right? Well, I could actually, if I was a workload, authenticate with a username and password as well. But the recommended way of doing it with workloads is to use certificates. So you actually sign a request. It's a JSON Web Token assertion that you sign. And that's what people should be doing. So we come through here, and the next job is we come out of here with MFA or single factor authentication. Right, because if we've already done MFA, it says so, right, in the cookies. The refresh token knows about it. Next thing is we've got our gatekeeper where we evaluate conditional access based on the location, everything that we've got going for us. We can do some remediation and require MFA. We could remediate requiring a password reset as well. And then what happens is we issue the new token. Right? Or it could be a new token that's just been refreshed or the first token. Okay, so that's sort of how it's happening. Now, workload identities, you go to conditional access and you say, hey, nothing about workload identities in my conditional access. And then you have to realize that Microsoft sort of moved it out of conditional access. And we've now got workload identities here, and you need another license for workload identities, right? So you actually need a premium license for workload identity. So you've got your P1 license, which allows you to do conditional access. P2 license gives you identity protection. And now you need another license to do workload identities. Right, so, and when you do workload identities with this new license, you'll also have identity protection for it as well. Adding sort of things to enhance decisions, we've got, Azure AD Identity Protection, you need a P2 license for that. You've got, it'll identify user risk, session risk, so we're feeding that information in. It's coming from, Microsoft's threat and risk telemetry, but you can enhance that, and we'll see in a second how that works. Then you've got the thing, is the thing compliant? What are the device properties? And to do that, you're going to need an MDM solution of some kind, and Microsoft would love you to use Intune, right? And then what we can do is we can bring Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps in, and that logs stuff into the telemetry. It does an awful lot more than just that. I'll come to that later. You've got Microsoft Defender for Identity, which is taking information from on-prem, because if you've got hybrid users, your users are sourced from on-prem, you bring them up into the cloud. If something happens to their on-prem account, you really should know about it in the cloud, right? So you use Microsoft Defender for Identity for that. And then if you're looking after your endpoints, then you've got Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, all enhancing signals, all with a slightly increased cost. But, what cost is security? I'll let the Microsoft guys sell it to you. Okay, so this is conditional access. If principal X, right, and principal X could be a user or a workload identity, wants to access resource Y, and resource Y is an application. It's a user workflow, such as resetting, putting in your security details. We can identify that. If someone's putting their security details, we want enhancement on that. And conditions A to G are met, the policy applies, right? We'll see what those conditions are in a minute. But it could be that you're at a particular location, a particular, and then if the policy applies, then it needs to meet requirements. I've got requirements L to Q, which is you need multi-factor, you need this, you need that. It must be joined to Azure and your corporate network as a hybrid joined device, right? And then, so what we can do is, if that's satisfied, you can grant access, or, you could say this policy blocks access. So if you wanted to, if you had legacy authentication, you would choose your legacy authentication clients. And legacy authentication, by the way, is where you put a username and password in a header, right? And it's particularly dangerous because you can do all sorts of attacks based on that. So you could block legacy authentication. But if that all works, then you push it through session controls, right? So we go through session controls themselves, which I will come back to. Now, most of these are pretty obvious, require multi-factor authentication, right? And then require, in here, multi-factor strength, right? This is where we choose to define the strength of the multi-factor device, right? And I'll show you this. I'm going to go through this really quickly now. There were just some things I wanted to bring out. Require devices to be marked as compliant. They need to be hybrid joined, so they're joined to Azure AD and on-prem AD, which gives you all the advantage of on-prem group policy and control from Azure AD. This one and the next one are slightly weird, and you think, what are these about? This is basically, the first option is a set of clients that are capable of supporting an app protection policy. And if you think about a mobile device, this mobile device can have both corporate data and user data on their personal data. And the idea is with a policy, protection policy, you basically wrap a bubble around the corporate data. So it can't be cut and pasted, and you can delete it. You can do a remote delete of it, but the personal data is still intact. Right? To do that, you need a particular client, and there are two options here. This one is saying only access to cloud apps from an approved client app, which is one that is capable of supporting a policy, and this one is saying with a policy in place. And then just going on from that, this next one here, require password change, right? You can only do a password change in conditional access in response to a user risk, right? And also, what's really important, the password change has to be done within the confines of conditional access because it needs to know it's happened. So the user must have already been set up for self-service password reset, right? So provided the user set up for self-service password reset and provided this is triggered by a identity risk classification, then you can do that. It is set, obviously, it requires MFA. It's also set for all cloud apps. You wouldn't do it, oh, someone's had their password stolen. Oh, just for that app, let them change their password. It's, it's for all apps. And then this thing here, Trusona ES, is a custom control. And it was a way of calling out to other providers to do an MFA check or something like that. And Trusona, one of these companies, that's probably the longest ever preview that's been in Azure AD. And I think it's going to be swapped out. All right, so it will never leave preview status. It will actually be changed the way that happens. And then you might have a whole series of checkboxes, and these are terms of use. Right? And you can create multiple terms of use in multiple languages and choose, oh, for this app, we need this terms of use. For that app, we need different terms of use, and so on. And then the last two things on here, whoops, I thought I had a slide. No, sorry. Require all the selected controls or require one. So you can choose one selected control or you can include them all. Okay. And the session controls I'm going to come back to in detail, and I will give you a little demo of actually using the conditional access app control, which is basically where we are in complete control of a session. We're allowing a session to an application, but we're going to pass it through a proxy in the sky. All right, it's a Microsoft proxy that can actually analyze what's going on and what files are being downloaded. And it can control access to that application. And that's using Microsoft Defender for cloud apps. And you can get very sophisticated rules and use that. So what you've got is monitor only, which is just monitors and says to the user, this is going to happen. You can go block downloads, or you can use a custom policy. And that custom policy is in Microsoft Defender for cloud apps. But we need that in place. Then there's the periodic reauthentication, whether you're using persistent browsers or persistent session tokens or cookies, if you like, or you're using session tokens or session cookies. And then customized continuous access evaluation. You can turn it, it's now turned on for the whole directory. That is the default setting. But if you have a problem going to one particular application, you can turn it off. And we've turned it off a few times where we got really complex network arrangements and you got sort of some form of network conditional access policy, and that can actually end up in trouble because we're going into this app in lots of different ways. So we have actually turned off CAE in some circumstances. And then disable resilience defaults. What Microsoft do is they have a secondary authentication service. So the primary one goes down, it will automatically switch to the secondary. But it's not a full-blown authentication service. What it basically does, if a user's got a session going, it will maintain that session and allow it to continue. But what it can't do is reevaluate real-time group membership changes or things like that. So you have to bear that in mind. If you felt that absolutely you couldn't tolerate that sort of behavior, right, you could turn it off and disable it. Problem is, if you disable it, if the authentication service goes down, nobody can carry on working. All right, or they might be able to carry on working for an hour until their tokens expire. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, after the break, I did actually put some information about the resilient settings, but I've actually covered that. So what I'll do is after the break, we'll talk about enhancing the session controls, and then I'll take you through the actual UI and explain some of the more esoteric bits and give you some demos along the way. So Microsoft Defender for cloud apps, for instance. I also want to show you authentication context, which is really powerful, and other bits and pieces. So how long are we doing our break for? Okay, so in terms of enhancing session controls, this is where we have actually decided we're going to allow someone to access the target application. Okay, so all those decisions have been made. And we've got app enforced restrictions. And if we use app enforced restrictions, it only works with SharePoint and Exchange, but it allows you to pass device information to the target system. Right. So you think, well, hang on a minute, why do I need to pass it? Because I could have blocked access, right? But if you think about SharePoint, it's a good example, is you've got multiple sites, right? And if you wanted to do a conditional access that blocked access to a site, based on you've got to be compliant with the device before you can gain access to this site. Then by passing that information through, we can put the decision point into SharePoint. I could make a decision, nobody's allowed to access SharePoint without a compliant device. I can do that in conditional access. But if I want to do it on a per site basis, I need to push the enforcement down into SharePoint. Use conditional access app control. And this is where we use the Microsoft Defender for cloud apps. And I talked about it before, where we're actually going to send the traffic through a proxy to a target system, right? And you can set up your own apps to work in this way. And I'll show you that. I'll give you a little demonstration. Sign-in frequency, how often you have to sign in. And you might say, well, when you're off the corporate network, I want you to sign in every hour, right? On the corporate network, we won't have that requirement. You can make those sort of decisions. And then whether you have persistent or non-persistent browser sessions. So whether you're using a persistent cookie, which lasts after you close the browser, or using a session cookie, which actually, when the browser closes, it's gone. So there's the session controls themselves. So what I want to do is take you through a sort of demo of setting up conditional access. And I'm going to go in, first of all, into my conditional access policies, which are here. And this is the Azure AD portal. This is the portal that is working with, Entra. Okay, I want to go to another portal with Entra in it, and this is actually a different directory. And I'm just going to go into Active Directory here, and I'm going to go down to Protect and Secure, Conditional Access, and we'll go New Policy. And if you look in here, the assignment is to users, and we click on there. Absolutely nothing about workload identities at all. And this is just really a reminder that to use workload identities, you need additional license. You can get a sample license here. Start Microsoft Entra Workload Identities free trial, right? That'll give you a 90-day free trial. So yes, that's you can, but you need another license. So if you go into conditional access and say, I can't see these workload identities, that's the reason. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my main dev environment and start off here. Now, the really, really important thing is with conditional access policies is name them sensibly, right? And you want to really be able to read what the policy does, right? So for instance, this one here, this one, I put the application first. So Azure Management, so that's my application. MFA for David and Tor, when, always, right? So you just make it really descriptive. As I say, I use individual users in my dev environment just so I understand which users are going to be affected by this policy. But obviously you'd be using groups in your own policy. The other thing to do is come up with, a convention. Do you put the app first? Do you put the users first? Whatever you do, but make it readable, make it understandable, and then put serial numbers at the beginning. Because if you're suddenly faced with a phone call and the phone call says, oh, disable the SharePoint app enforcement restrictions for, blah, 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 and you go, oh, where's that? In panic. Disable SN006 or whatever it is. All right, so that's a really important thing to do. Okay, you go new policies, there are templates, and there are more and more templates starting. And require multi-factor authentication for admins, securing security info registration. And you can look to see how Microsoft are recommending doing this if you've never done it before. The other thing is you can get a JSON file down. So if you open that, you can see all this, and you can actually configure through this JSON file. You can actually configure your policy, and just for fun, I stuck that into ChatGPT and said, I don't know, I can't remember what I said. I think prettify or something like that. Display as JSON. Oops. And into that, and I know I spelled Jason wrong, but it didn't seem to mind. It must spell badly as well. And what it's done is it's actually not displayed it as Jason, but it's gone through and looked. It's actually told me sort of what it's doing. Okay, so I can't remember what I said. Maybe if I spelled Jason correctly, it would have displayed it. But again, start experimenting with things like ChatGPT and using it as your buddy. Okay, so again, templates. There are templates that apply to Zero Trust. Some of them, there are different tabs. Some of them appear in all the tabs, or you can look at all. And this is getting bigger and bigger. This list of sort of prefabbed, if you like, policies. So I'm going to go in and go new policy, all right? And number one, really, really important, give it a sensible name, okay? And go into this policy knowing what you want to achieve, right? It's a bit like, the old NT file system, right? And people would go in there not really understanding what they want to achieve, and they'd change all sorts of permissions and everything else, and they'd be in a complete mess. Whereas actually, if you went in with an aim, it was actually quite easy to configure. And this is very similar here. Assignments, users or workload identities. So we can have users, we can have none, we can have all users, in which case that's everyone, all right? But if you put a block on all users, you will block all users, and you will break the system. So what's really, really important is exclude. So absolutely 100% exclude your CA administrator, probably administrators, and exclude what we call break glass accounts. I mean, if you're not familiar with a break glass account is your emergency get into Azure AD account. It is not an account for an individual, it's an account for a department, right? So really long password, probably don't use multi-factor, because if multi-factor's gone down, how are you gonna get in? All right, don't use the domain name. So it's going to be on Microsoft.com. All right, and if you're paranoid about it, you can have a really long password which only is split. All right, and you put one half in one safe and one half in another safe, and the team bring it together, and that's how they get back in. So exclude your break glass accounts, because rather than having to ring Microsoft up and say, I can't get in, I changed my conditional access, you can just use a break glass. But if you put your conditional access administrator in as excludes, then you'll be successful as well. So that's the exclude is really important. If we go back to includes, selected users and groups, and then we got guests, and there's classification of different types of guests based on whether they're an external user, whether they've got a member attribute as a type or a guest attribute, and so on. You've got, which I think is really nice, all the directory roles now. So you can basically on RBAC roles, the conditional access applies. Or you can go for users and groups and obviously choose your users and groups that this applies to. If we go to, we'll just switch that back to none. If we go to workload identities, we can do workload identities in here. And we could go all owned service principals, right? Or we could do selected service principals. And you can select your individual applications, because basically it's an application identity. So that's your workload identity. So that's where it's coming from. Now, what's really nice and a really nice feature is you've got ability now to filter. And you filter on things called security attributes. And what you can do is you can create an attribute set which you can attach to user principals, and you can attach them also to service principals, right? And you can define what that attribute set is. And very interestingly, global admin, do everything in the directory, except for attribute sets. You actually have to be added in. You can be an attribute set definer, an attribute set reader, and so on. And so I've got an attribute set, and I can go in here, and I can say yes to configure, and I can choose. I can go department. So this is going to look at the department attribute, and I can say if it equals engineering, this policy applies. So now I have a whole bunch of applications. I don't need to know their name. I just need to know it's an engineering application, right? And now I can apply my conditional access policy to all engineering applications. And that is really powerful. So you need to create the attribute sets first, which is not a difficult task. You then need to attach those attribute sets to service principals. Again, not a difficult task. And then you can use them here. So that's very recent actually, and a very nice part working. So I think we probably, and don't forget you've got excludes as well. Now, having chosen our user or our workload identity, we then choose, all right, whether we're going to cloud apps, or whether we're going to user actions, or whether we're going to things called authentication contexts, right? Now, a cloud app is, when I was showing you that filter, it was filtering out the workloads based on the application name. You can do exactly the same. If you do selected apps here, you can base it on which apps it applies to in terms of the target. This is the target application. Right, so we can base it in here, and it's exactly the same. So I would turn it on. I would choose my attribute I want to work with. I don't know. Let's call it marketing or social media. I don't even know I've got anything set in social media. No, I haven't. I haven't got any values in social media. But so I could actually define a value myself. But again, this is cloud apps or actions is what you're targeting. So, and I could also put in here is I'm saying this policy is going to apply when someone is registering their security information, okay? Or I could say this policy applies when someone uses a particular authentication context. And what you can do is define authentication context. I've got C1, C2, because that's the label name, actually, but you could have any name you like in there. So require MFA, step up, require something else. And what happens is when you go up to Azure, you pass the authentication context in that string, and it triggers it. So as an example of that is if I go to my client, where's my client? My Windows 10 client. And actually, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to go back into conditional access, and we'll do it in here actually, so I don't have to drop out of there. Go into conditional access, and it was, I think it was 14, wasn't it? Yeah, 14. I'm just going to turn off 14. You remember I turned on MFA for the second app, so I'm just going to save that, and we'll now go back to my Windows 10, close that off, and now I can go in and go to OIDC v2. I can sign in. Let's do code flow. Why not? Update that, and then code flow. We'll go in as John, and having gone in as John, what we can do is at any point trigger this authentication context. So we go home on that, and I'm going to trigger the C1 authentication context for an ID token. And what that will do is it's tied into requiring MFA. And so click on that, and boom. All right, so it's now step up on that. The other beauty of this is you can actually use it with SharePoint. So if I go to my SharePoint, and I actually want to, okay, it's used my cookie, wrong user. So I'm going to go to SharePoint as my user, James. By the way, when I'm testing, I never use persistent cookies. The reason being I continuously, why is that not? It worked before when we didn't have an identity. There we go, James. Yeah, so just to finish that conversation, I never use persistent cookies because I always like to see the authentication because I know exactly what I'm doing. And most of the time I'm authenticating as all sorts of people in testing. So I'm signing in here as James, and everything works beautifully, except when I go to legal case law, I've got a authentication context which is going to require me to do my terms of service. And if you look at the, I think I've got it open. Let's go back in here. If we look at SharePoint and my active site, if I look at the legal case law site, if you look at policies, you've got a sensitivity label which has been set up, and sensitivity labels have to be created in Purview, and then they take forever to propagate out. But I've actually got my C2 authentication context. By the way, C2 is the actual parameter value, right? C1, C2, C3, all the way up to 25. Again, rather than putting a level of abstraction on it, I keep C1, C2, C3, just so I know what I'm testing for, right? But you would probably call it here, instead of C2 authentication context, you would require terms of service is the name that you'd have on the label. Okay, does that gives you what you wanted, does it?
Thank you very much.
Good, okay. So that's authentication context. If we go back into here, my conditional access, oh, I thought I left it open. I obviously didn't. Oh no, that's very weird. Hang on, I'm on the right directory. Yeah, anyway, doesn't matter. I'll go back in. So what are we looking for? Conditional access over here. And again, new policy. So we target to a cloud app, to an action, or an authentication context. Okay. Next thing is our conditions and user risk. Right. So I can say if the user risk is reported as high, this policy applies. Right. And where does the user risk come from? It comes from Microsoft Identity Protection. Right. So we're gonna need identity protection. We're gonna need a P2 license to be able to use this. User risk is a sort of background task. Oh, these credentials have been found on the dark web. So leak credentials. You know, this behavior over time is looking very odd. Right? If we look at sign-in risk, it's based on sort of real-time evaluation. Oh, somebody's coming from a Tor endpoint. Do we want an anonymizer in our system coming in? I had one organization where people were using their phones and they suddenly decided, oh, this anonymizer app seems good for personal security. And they all put it on and nobody could log into Azure AD with their phones because they were all being rejected. Device platforms, and this is think, exclude, right? Because actually what you can do is you can go configure it and say any device, right? And you can block any device. Fantastic. What's the point of that? Exclude Windows phones. Anyone got a Windows phone still? No, I don't think we'll exclude Windows phones, but we could exclude Windows. So basically, this policy is going to block everybody except someone using a Windows device, right? So that's why I'm saying think about excludes, because sometimes they can be really, really useful. If we go down to location, location is we've got any location, all trusted or selected locations. And that's worth actually just jumping out of this for a second. And I'm going to go to named locations. And what you can do is you can create a location. So GPS blocked countries. So these are countries that are going to be blocked. That's my name, GPS blocked countries. I say this applies to, these are countries that I want to be blocked based on GPS signal, right? So that's the selection. And basically it's doing it on GPS here. And, you know, I'm not going to go through the list because somebody could get offended. I blocked their country or something. So we won't go through that in detail. IP block countries, same thing, but using IP address instead. And then what you can do is you can create what you feel are maybe, well, they could be safe zones or not safe zones. So you could actually define them as trusted locations. So you could say anyone coming from a trusted location, okay. All right, but this location does not have to be trusted. We could actually block that location if we didn't say it was trusted. I mean, you could block everyone from trusted locations. That's probably not a good idea, though. All right. So there's that setting in there. So this is quite powerful. And then lastly, you may have come across trusted locations with the old MFA configuration. So trusted IPs. This, don't use it anymore. And really you should migrate away from it because it will disappear at some point. All of your sort of methods for doing MFA were down here. Notice I haven't got any selected. And the reason is I've migrated away from them because there's the new authentication policies. And that's where we decide what we're doing. So what you've got is this legacy policy, and then you've got the new authentication policy. And you can go into a migration state, which basically says, ignore the old ones, or look at the old ones and look at the new ones and mix them together, right? So you can go through that, or you can start off, I'm not migrated yet, so use the legacy ones. But as soon as you've said you can use either, or you can actually turn off them in here. And at some point, this will be depreciated. No idea when, but you should be moving away. They did originally announce that, I think it was January 2024, they were going to turn off the legacy policies. So you needed to be in the new. If you're not familiar with the authentication policy or authentication methods, policies, they're in here. So this defines all the different ways I can authenticate, and I can target groups, and I can configure and so on. Okay, so that's in there. I say I've done a really comprehensive. It's about an hour long YouTube video, but I've actually indexed it all so you can jump around, look at the different methods. Okay, let's go back into conditional access. Go new policy again, and we were in conditions, locations we've done, client apps. Here you go. Exchange Active Sync apps. Oops, yes. Exchange Active Sync, other apps, and if you look at other apps, they're things like POP and IMAP and SMTP, things you do not want to be using because they've got, authentication context in headers. All right, so so what you do is you create a very simple policy and just go block, right, for those, and that is your block legacy authentication, basically. And then quite nice is filter for devices. You can actually come in here and you can create expressions. So you can go, oh, need to turn it on first. So we choose a property. I don't know, what should we call it? Let's do something. Let's go and use an extension attribute where we put our own information in it. And we could choose equals, and we can say secure admin workstation, so Azure, right? And then we can add the expression, and then we can go and device is compliant equals true. So you can come up with, so now it's saying device extension attributes equals SOAR and device is compliant equals true. So you can come up with some fairly complex, sort of device filters, and that's a very nice feature. Okay, so that finishes that. Access control, grant or block. Okay, don't use block if you can remediate it. All right, block risky users. Well, risky user, let's make sure they're doing MFA. Let's make sure they do a password reset. All right, but you can obviously block if need be. Require multi-factor authentication, and then require authentication strength. All right, and that's in preview at the moment. And if we look under authentication methods, we can see the authentication strength down here somewhere. And what you can do is the authentication strength could be multi-factor, in which case you can use a FIDO2 security key, you can use Windows Hello for Business, blah, 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 temporary access path, and the list goes on. Or you could go passwordless MFA, in which case you are into Windows Hello for Business. FIDO2 security key will allow you to do passwordless. Certificate-based authentications will. Notice it's got a policy OID of 1234. That's because it has to be, it needs that policy OID to be considered to be a multi-factor certificate. And the Microsoft Authenticator. Or you could choose phishing resistant, and you've got Windows Hello, you've got FIDO2 security key, and you've got certificate-based authentication. Right? Or you can go, I'd like a new authentication strength, please, and I choose exactly what I want, right? And then you can go into, I can go into my conditional access policy, and I can go down to OIDC 1. OIDC 1. It's this guy, SN005. You remember the OIDC one, we've always required MFA. Yeah. So I can come down here under my grant and I can turn off that. You can't have them both on at the same time. Go for authentication strength. And I go in here and I choose phishing resistant. Okay. So select that and let's go and experience that. So I'm going to go back to my client and I'm going to go to OIDC v1 and I'm going to sign in with OpenID and I've just gone in as James. Why? Because I've got my browser open. Remember I went to SharePoint as James, so cancel that and let's go into OIDC v1 again and OpenID. And I'm going to go in as my user, John, enter the password, and that's strange. Did I actually turn that policy on? Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking that doesn't look quite right to me. Thank you very much. LIDC1. And yeah, I didn't click save. It always helps, actually. It's surprising that. Okay, so we're going to OIDCV1. We're going to go in as John. Sign in. And it says you can't get there from here, right? Because it knows John is not set up with a phishing resistant software. So let's go in as another user called Tina. Oh, and actually, I'm going to have to do this. I'm going to have to do this from, because it won't read the FIDO2 key over the RDP connection. So I'm going to go in. Let's just close that. I'm going to go in here, and we'll sign in as Tina. And Tina is lucky enough to have a FIDO2 security key with a biometric on it. Okay, so we're going to sign in as Tina, and it's trying to do certificate-based authentication, which I don't want. And actually, do you know what? Hang on, I think I may have messed up my user. I'm trying to think who I've got on that key. I thought it was Tina, but maybe it's John. Hang on, did I make a note of it? I don't think I did. Sorry, it's V-John. So OpenID and my user V-John, this is a different John, all right? The other one was John. So touch the security key, and I'm going to touch the security key. It's reading my biometric, and I'm in, and it's used FIDO, and it's showing MFA strength. So that is phishing resistant MFA in action. Okay, so let's go back to my conditional access, and we'll go new policy in here again, and we've got the grants. I don't think there's very much else to say about this. I think I've been through everything. So yeah, no, there's nothing else to say in there. Let's go to session control. And with session control, what I can do is I can tell it to use conditional access app control. And I can use a custom policy. So this is using Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. I can use a custom policy, in which case the policy is written in Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, or I can actually use, I could monitor only or block downloads. So let's, first of all, go and experience this as my user. So I'm going to come in to OIDC v2, and I'm going to go in as John in here. OIDC v2, come on, I'll become OpenID Connect. We're signing in as my user John. He's different to V-John, just use the password. He's in, go home on that. And I can download a PDF. So download a PDF, I can download a docx, I can download a PowerPoint, and that's it, all working. Notice the URL. Let me just grab that and go into Notepad. The URL is xtsoidcv2.xtshub.com. Okay, so now I'm going to go into my conditional access, and I'm going to come back up here to conditional access. And what I want is policy SN009. What this says is it's basically, it's got one app included, which is OIDCV2. And what it's saying is the session control is set to use conditional access app control. Okay, so I'm going to turn that on and save that. Now, it may take a couple of minutes to ripple through. Something you have to be aware of, you make a change in Azure AD, sometimes it can take 10 minutes before something happens. So there's definite latency in various areas. So I'm going to go back to my Windows 10, and I'm going to try and go again with this. So we'll close that off, go up into OIDC v2, and I'm going to connect. And I'm going to connect as John. Signing in, and it's not picked it up. Were you watching? Did I save it this time? It could just be a latency issue. So Microsoft Defender Cloud App on, and it is saved. Okay. And it's specified for all users. So this should definitely kick in. Let's try it again. And again, we're going to OpenID Connect to your tenant. We'll go in as my user, John. That's it. It says it's being monitored. Right, so it's informing John it's being monitored. Now, if I continue to the app, let me grab that and let me pop that in here. You can see it's going to oidcv2.xdshub.com.mcas.microsoft. So it's going through their proxy service to get there. And their proxy service is monitoring what's happening. So if I go back over here and now go, hang on, what's going on here? Hang on, have I got two windows open? Let me just double check that. I expected to see my downloads. So let me just try signing in again. Home on that. Oh yeah, so download PDF, download doc, download PPTX. Download PPTX, and it's blocked. All right, download a PDF, and it succeeds. So you've got this app knows nothing about Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, right? Nothing changed in the app at all, no appreciation of what's going on, and it's Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps going through the proxy that is actually managing all of this and actually blocking that traffic. So you can, decide eventually you get to the application, but now you can put in additional controls. Okay, and that is pretty much conditional access in action, or the core of it. And sort of watch this space. Don't be surprised if things change along the way. They certainly will do. But in terms of working with conditional access, start simply. Right? Don't get overcomplicated. Don't try and put too much in the same policy either. Keep your policies really nice and clean, and also absolutely make sure that you name them properly. If you don't, you will be in a complete mess. You've now got the ability, actually, have they brought the ability? You will have, yes, I mean, it's either now or very shortly, you will have the ability to download the conditional access as JSON. Yes, I know you can download it. Yeah, I'm pretty certain you can do it in an ordinary one. Or maybe not, hang on. I could look. Do you remember? Have you seen it, Jack? No, I don't think you can upload, but I don't think you can download today one of your policies, but expect that very, very soon. Really think about what you're trying to achieve. So don't just go, oh yeah, well, I have one of them. You will get yourself in a complete mess. Really think it through.